French police officer went to see Frantz Fanon, a psychiatrist, and asked him for help. Not to stop torturing people, to keep doing it without the guilt. That scene is in The Wretched of the Earth, a book often remembered reductively for one chapter on violence, the chapter where Fanon calls it, quote, a cleansing force, end quote, something that rids the colonized of their inferiority complex. But the officer isn't in that chapter. He's near the end. In the movements the caricature skips. Because the book doesn't end on the gun. It ends in a psychiatric clinic, and then in a plea to build a new kind of human. So here's the question this episode turns on. Does the way The Wretched of the Earth actually ends change who we think Fanon was, or only what he wanted? We'll read the three movements that close it: culture, the clinic, and the conclusion. And we'll come back to that officer, because I still can't get his case to sit still. What Fanon wanted first is a culture. And here he surprises people who expect a simple call to go back to roots. The comfortable idea is that a colonized people recovers itself just by reclaiming the authentic traditions the colonizer tried to stamp out. The costumes, the customs, the old songs. Fanon's warning is more precise. A purely backward-looking recovery, cut off from the present fight, isn't enough. After generations of domination, he argues, what survives as tradition can harden into a husk. Here's how he puts it, and every quotation in this episode is from Richard Philcox's translation. Fanon writes, quote, after 1 or 2 centuries of exploitation, the national cultural landscape has radically shriveled, end quote. What's left is an inventory of customs and costumes, a museum piece, and clinging only to that is a kind of mourning that mistakes itself for a fight. You can hear how live this still is. The recent deals to return the Benin bronzes to Nigeria make the question concrete. Getting the objects back matters, but it doesn't answer Fanon's harder question, which is what a people does next. Is a culture a heritage you keep behind glass, or is it something you make right now in the act of fighting for yourself? He watches the colonized writer move through stages, from imitating the colonizer to turning back toward his own people, but moving among them like a stranger, and finally, inside the struggle itself, to something living, what Fanon names combat literature. Now here's where a careful reader should push back. Fanon observes that a people's poetry tends to thin out as the practical demands of the struggle take over. That risks making art answer to politics, and pushed to its end, that standard builds a cage of its own. Fanon doesn't resolve it. What he wanted built isn't a shrine to what was lost. It's a culture that belongs to a people remaking itself. The same book we file under violence turns, in its final chapter, into the most damning thing a doctor can write about violence: a record of what it does to the man who deals it out. Fanon writes here as both clinician and theorist, combining clinical case histories with an argument about colonial psychiatry, drawn from the years he ran a hospital psychiatric department in Algeria, until the French expelled him in 1957, and from his later work in Tunis. And it's hard to read, because Fanon puts Algerian victims and colonial agents in the same clinical frame, without ever asking you to treat what they did as morally equal. He records Algerians the war had left with lasting psychiatric injury. And then there's that officer, a European police officer involved in torture, who came to Fanon with an anxiety he could not shake. And what he wanted from the doctor was not to stop. Fanon writes that the man, quote, asked me in plain language to help him torture Algerian patriots without having a guilty conscience, end quote. He wanted, Fanon says, total peace of mind. So the harm Fanon records isn't symmetrical. On one side, the shattered minds of the tortured. On the other, a torturer with a different, damning disorder. A man whose complaint is that his conscience still works and who wants it switched off. This is the same author, in flat clinical prose, showing you what the violence does to the man who commits it. There's a later idea, often called a moral injury framework, that clinicians developed decades after, for the harm that can follow from doing the things that violate your own conscience. It's a modern lens, read back onto a 1961 case, and this one is stranger than the category, because the officer isn't trying to reckon with his guilt. He's asking to have it removed. And underneath the case files is a claim that took direct aim at the psychiatry of Fanon's own day. The so-called Algiers School, associated with the psychiatrist Antoine Perot, had held that the North African was constitutionally impulsive and prone to criminality, that violence was simply in the nature of the man. Fanon, with the cases in front of him, argues the reverse. The impulsiveness, the so-called criminality, he says, is, quote, the direct result of the colonial situation, end quote, not temperament. The pressure of a world built to crush a person. So this final chapter is the one that turns the colonial science against itself. And the verdict on Fanon still isn't in. Then the conclusion. Fanon writes, quote, let us leave this Europe, which never stops talking of man, yet massacres him at every one of its street corners, end quote. Read alone, it can sound like a call to burn Europe down. I read it as a warning, not a call for retaliation. Fanon isn't telling the colonized to attack Europeans. He's telling them not to become them. The danger he names is imitation, a people winning its freedom and then rebuilding the colonizer's world under a new flag. And his own conclusion sets the dare plainly. If all you want is to turn Africa or America into a new Europe, he says, then you may as well hand your countries back to the Europeans, who would do a better job. The point being, don't. Don't, in his phrase, ape Europe, because a copy would only carry the disease. And the closing note isn't destruction. It's a call to invent, to be pioneers, and, in his words, to create a new man. Fanon doesn't use the phrase new humanism. That's my name for it. But that's the shape of it, a way of being human that doesn't take its measure from the civilization that colonized it. Not a new empire wearing a different face, something genuinely new. So, back to the fork. Does the ending change who Fanon was or only what he wanted? I think it's the second. The book's closing movements go from a clinic to a plea, and that genuinely complicates the caricature. But the easy move is to stop right there and hand you a gentler Fanon, and that would be a lie by omission. The conclusion gives Fanon a destination. It doesn't give him an acquittal. The art in a cage worry from the culture chapter is still open, and a plea to create a new man doesn't unlock it. And the hard thing sits in the first chapter, where that cleansing force is still on the page. Fanon endorses anti-colonial violence there and counts its cost in the clinic, in the same book. And part of the reason we missed the second half is that Sartre's preface, hotter than anything Fanon wrote, pulls readers toward the violence and away from everything else. And here's the case I can't get to sit still. That officer asked to keep torturing with the guilt switched off, and Fanon wrote it down with the clinician's flatness. No cry of outrage, just the request set on the page. And I keep turning over what that flatness is. The refusal of a doctor to look away from even this or something colder, a page that stays calm about a man doing monstrous things. I genuinely don't know. So that's where an honest reading leaves it. The Apostle of Violence is a label that leans on selective attention, and sometimes on a preface Fanon didn't write. But the ending doesn't retract the first chapter either. Read the whole book, watch what he wanted made, and notice how much of what we do to a thinker depends on which page we decide to stop on.